The final golden notes of the sunset faded like the last strains of a song over Willow Creek, Colorado, as Tabitha Calloway stood frozen before the saloon's expectant crowd, her throat as dry as the desert wind that had carried her to this remote town. A year had passed since tragedy silenced the voice that once made her the darling of Denver's finest establishments, and tonight was to be her triumphant return. Yet, when the piano struck its opening chord, her voice remained locked away, a prisoner of grief and memory. The patrons' murmurs grew louder as Tabitha's hands trembled against the silk of her emerald performance gown. Tears threatened to spill as she stood paralyzed, when a tall figure rose from the back of the room, his spurs jingling softly as he approached. Preston Zachary removed his worn Stetson, revealing sun-weathered features softened by eyes that seemed to understand her silence without explanation. "Folks," he announced to the increasingly restless crowd, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard, "I believe Miss Calloway needs a moment, but the night ain't ruined." He stepped onto the small stage beside her, leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to sing tonight, Miss Calloway. Not today, not ever again if that's what your heart tells you." Then, to her astonishment, this rough-hewn cowboy turned to the crowd and said words that would forever change her life. "She can't bring herself to sing again, so I'll sing for us both." And sing he did. His voice, untrained but rich with emotion, filled the saloon with a folk ballad about a wandering soul seeking home. The crowd fell silent, captivated not by technical perfection but by the raw honesty in every note. Tabitha felt something shift inside her as she watched this stranger bare his soul to save her dignity. It was 1878, and Tabitha Calloway had traveled west following personal devastation that had stolen not only her beloved twin sister, but also her will to perform. At 24, she had once been half of the Calloway sisters, a singing duo that had entertained in Denver's finest establishments. Now she was alone, her identity fractured, seeking solace in a small frontier town where no one knew her story. Preston Zachary, 30 years old and trail-worn, hadn't intended to stay in Willow Creek. A cattle drive had brought him through, but something about the town's quiet dignity amid frontier harshness made him linger. He'd taken odd jobs, eventually working as security for the Golden Nugget Saloon where Tabitha had been engaged to perform. When the final notes of his song faded, the crowd erupted in appreciative applause. Preston nodded once, replaced his hat, and offered Tabitha his arm. "Allow me to escort you safely to your lodgings, Miss Calloway." Outside in the cool evening air, Tabitha found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Zachary. I've never been rescued quite so thoroughly." "Preston," he corrected gently. "And it wasn't a rescue, just one traveler helping another through a rough patch of trail." "How did you know?" she asked, her eyes searching his face in the lamplight. "How did you know I couldn't, that I wouldn't be able to?" "The look in your eyes," he said simply. "I've seen it before." "In my own reflection." He paused before the boarding house where she was staying. "Rest well, Miss Calloway. Tomorrow's another day." As Preston tipped his hat and turned to leave, Tabitha called after him, "Mr. Zachary Preston, will you tell me someday about what silenced your song?" He glanced back, a sad smile touching his lips. "Perhaps, when you're ready to tell me about yours." The following morning, Tabitha awakened to the sound of activity in Willow Creek's Main Street. From her window, she watched as the town came alive, merchants opening shops, ranch hands riding through on early errands, and women gathering at the well. She dressed simply in a practical blue cotton dress, determined to face the day with as much dignity as possible after last night's failure. Mrs. Winters, the boarding house proprietor, greeted her with a sympathetic smile as she descended the stairs. "Good morning, Miss Calloway. I've saved you some breakfast." "Thank you, though I'm not certain I can face much of anyone today," Tabitha admitted, taking a seat at the dining table. "Nonsense," the older woman replied briskly. "Folk around here understand that sometimes life knocks the wind out of a person. Besides, that cowboy of yours saved the evening. I haven't heard singing with that much heart in years." "He's not my cowboy," Tabitha corrected quickly, feeling an unexpected flush warm her cheeks. Mrs. Winters merely smiled. "Well, whoever he is, he's waiting outside, has been for nearly an hour." Tabitha nearly choked on her coffee. "Pardon me," said he had a proposition for you. "Professional," he assured me, Mrs. Winters added with a knowing look. "Though in my experience, men don't wait an hour in the morning sun unless there's something more than business on their minds." Finishing her breakfast hastily, Tabitha smoothed her hair and stepped onto the porch. Preston Zachary stood beside the hitching post, looking considerably more composed than he had the previous evening. His tall frame was straight as a pine, his brown hair neatly combed, though his clothes still bore the practical simplicity of a working cowhand. "Miss Calloway," he greeted, removing his hat, "I hope you rested well." "As well as could be expected," she replied honestly. "Mrs. Winters says you have a proposition for me." "I do." Preston gestured toward two chairs on the porch. "May we sit?" Once settled, he continued, "Mr. Hollister, the saloon owner, still needs entertainment. The miners and cowboys who frequent his establishment expect it, and without it, they might take their business elsewhere." "I'm aware," Tabitha said quietly, "and I've failed to fulfill my contract." "That's not how he sees it, or how I presented it to him," Preston said. "I've suggested an alternative, a partnership of sorts." Tabitha's eyebrows rose. "What kind of partnership?" "You play piano beautifully. I noticed that before you were to sing, I can carry a tune, as you witnessed. Together, we might provide something unique, different from what you planned, but perhaps exactly what you need right now." Tabitha studied him, looking for signs of pity or deceit, but finding only straightforward honesty. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." "I know what it's like to lose your voice," he said simply. "Not just the ability to sing, but the will to do so. I know how it feels when something you love becomes tangled with something that brings pain." She looked away, fighting unexpected tears. "And you think performing together would help me find my voice again?" "I think it might help us both remember why music matters," he corrected gently. "No pressure to sing, Miss Calloway. Just your fingers on the keys, my voice carrying the melodies, and maybe in time whatever haunts you might loosen its grip." Tabitha considered his offer, weighing the terrifying prospect of returning to that stage against the practical reality of needing employment. "What does Mr. Hollister say about this arrangement?" "He's willing to give us 3 nights. If the patrons approve, the engagement continues." She nodded slowly. "And if I never sing again, then I'll sing for us both," Preston repeated his words from the previous night. "For as long as necessary." Their first performance together that evening carried a nervous energy. Tabitha's fingers trembled slightly over the piano keys as Preston stood beside her, his presence both reassuring and unfamiliar. The saloon had filled with curious patrons, word having spread about the previous night's unexpected turn of events. "Ready?" Preston asked quietly as the hour approached. Tabitha nodded, unable to speak. She began with a gentle introduction, her fingers finding comfort in the familiar patterns of the keyboard. When Preston's voice joined her playing a rich baritone that complemented the piano's tones perfectly, she felt something unlock within her chest. Not her voice, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of healing. They performed 5 songs that night, each one receiving increasingly enthusiastic applause. Tabitha found herself watching Preston as he sang, noting how he closed his eyes during emotional passages, how his hands sometimes sketched shapes in the air to emphasize a lyric. He performed with an authenticity that made his lack of formal training irrelevant. When they finished, Mr. Hollister approached them with a broad smile. "Well, that was something different. The crowd loved it. Consider yourselves hired for the week with an option to extend." As they walked back to her boarding house later that night, Tabitha found her curiosity growing. "Where did you learn those songs? I don't recognize all of them." Preston smiled, his face half hidden in shadow. "Some were my mother's. She came from Virginia, brought her songs west with her. Others I picked up on cattle drives and in mining camps. Music travels well in open country." "You never had training, just church singing as a boy and whatever could be learned around campfires." He glanced at her. "Unlike you, you've had proper instruction." Tabitha nodded. "Since childhood, my father believed in education, even for daughters, especially in music." "And your sister?" Preston asked gently. "The one you lost." Tabitha stopped walking, startled. "How did you mentioned her name? Last night when you were having your difficulty, I can't, Tessa, you said." Tabitha hadn't realized she'd spoken aloud during her moment of panic. "Yes, my twin. We performed together for years." Preston didn't press further, seeming to understand she'd shared all she could manage for one evening. They continued in comfortable silence until reaching her door. "Tomorrow evening, same time," he confirmed. "Yes." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Preston, for understanding what I needed without making me explain." "Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones we can't yet tell," he replied. "Good night, Miss Calloway." "Tabitha," she corrected with a small smile. "If we're to be partners, you should use my given name." Days stretched into weeks as their musical partnership flourished. Each evening, Tabitha's confident piano playing provided the foundation for Preston's increasingly assured vocals. They expanded their repertoire, with Preston teaching her folk songs he'd learned in his travels, while she introduced him to more structured compositions that showcased his natural talent. During daylight hours, they often rehearsed in the empty saloon, the morning light streaming through windows that would be shuttered by evening. It was during these quieter moments that their personal stories began to emerge in fragments. "My father was a banker in Boston," Preston revealed one morning as they worked through a particularly challenging arrangement. "He wanted me to follow in his footsteps. Had my whole life planned out: prestigious college, marriage to an appropriate young lady, eventual partnership in his firm." Tabitha's fingers paused on the keys. "What happened? War happened. I enlisted in '63, served until Appomattox, came back changed like so many did." He stared out the window. "Couldn't stand the confines of those brick buildings and social expectations anymore. Headed west the day after my father told me I needed to put all that unpleasantness behind me." "Have you ever been back?" she asked. Preston shook his head. "They write occasionally, I answer when I can, but that life, it belongs to someone I no longer recognize." In turn, Tabitha gradually shared pieces of her own story. How she and Tessa had been inseparable from birth, their voices naturally harmonizing before they even understood what music was. How they'd built a modest reputation performing in Denver's cultural circles. "We were returning from a private performance at a mining magnate's home," she explained one afternoon as they walked along Willow Creek's dusty Main Street. "A late spring storm had made the mountain roads treacherous. The carriage, it went over the edge." Preston said nothing, simply offering his steady presence beside her. "I was thrown clear somehow. Tessa wasn't." Tabitha's voice remained remarkably steady, though her eyes reflected a pain that time had not diminished. "I tried to reach her. I could hear her calling my name, but the slope was too steep, the snow too deep." "When did this happen?" Preston asked quietly. 14 months ago. I haven't sung a note since the funeral." She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Everyone told me it would get easier with time. That performing again would honor her memory. But every time I try, I hear her voice joining mine, and then I remember she's gone, and I simply can't." Preston nodded, understanding etched in his features. "Some wounds don't heal according to others' timetables." That evening's performance carried an emotional depth that hadn't been present before. Though Tabitha still didn't sing, her playing conveyed feelings she couldn't yet voice. Preston seemed to intuitively understand, his vocals responding to the emotional currents flowing from her fingertips. The audience responded with appreciative silence followed by heartfelt applause. As they finished their final number, an elderly miner approached their piano, his weathered hat clutched respectfully in gnarled hands. "Begging your pardon," he said, addressing them both. "But that last song, it reminded me of my Margaret, gone these 30 years now. Would you play it again tomorrow? It's her birthday." Tabitha looked up at the man's weathered face, seeing grief still fresh despite the decades. "Of course we will," she promised softly. "And perhaps," she hesitated, then continued, "perhaps you could tell us a little about her tomorrow, so we might play it with her spirit in mind." The man's eyes widened with grateful surprise. "I'd be honored, miss, truly honored." As he walked away, Preston gave her a questioning look. "That was kind of you." "Music connects people to their memories," Tabitha said. "That's something Tessa always believed. Maybe by helping others honor their lost loved ones, I can begin to find a way to honor her." The following evening, the old miner returned with a small, faded daguerreotype of a young woman with laughing eyes. He told them how Margaret had loved dancing and wildflowers and could whistle better than any man in their mining camp. When they played his requested song, Tabitha felt something shift within her, not a readiness to sing again, but perhaps a willingness to see her music as something that could heal rather than simply remind her of loss. As spring warmed into summer, Tabitha and Preston's musical partnership became a cornerstone of Willow Creek's social life. Their performances drew travelers from neighboring settlements, and the Golden Nugget prospered. Mr. Hollister, recognizing their value, offered them a more permanent arrangement with increased pay. Their personal relationship deepened alongside their professional one. Preston began calling at the boarding house on Sunday afternoons, when the saloon remained closed in deference to the town's religious sensibilities. They would take walks along the creek, share books they'd discovered, or simply sit in comfortable conversation on Mrs. Winter's porch. Tabitha found herself studying Preston when he wasn't aware the way sunlight caught the auburn highlights in his brown hair, how his smile came more readily now than when they'd first met, the gentle strength in hands that could break a wild horse, yet turn the pages of poetry with reverence. For his part, Preston seemed equally captivated by her. He noticed how Tabitha had begun humming softly while working through new pieces, not singing, but allowing melody to escape in some small measure. He observed how the haunted shadow in her eyes had begun to recede, replaced by moments of genuine joy. "You're staring again, Mr. Zachary," Tabitha teased one Sunday as they rested beneath a cottonwood tree after a long walk. "Appreciating," he corrected with a smile. "There's a difference." "And what exactly are you appreciating?" she asked, smoothing her skirts with suddenly nervous hands. "The way you've changed since that first night. You carry your grief differently now, not gone, but not consuming you either." His expression grew serious. "You're braver than you know, Tabitha." She looked away, uncomfortable with his assessment. "I haven't done anything brave, I still can't sing." "Courage isn't about conquering fear all at once," Preston said. "It's about continuing despite it. Every night you walk onto that stage knowing what you've lost, what memories might ambush you, that's bravery." Tabitha considered his words. "I suppose we're both learning to live with our ghosts in our own ways." "Yes," Preston agreed, his voice softening. "And finding that life continues to offer unexpected gifts, even after great loss." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings. Tabitha found herself wondering what it might be like to close the distance between them, to discover if his lips were as gentle as his words. Before she could decide, the church bell rang in the distance, reminding them of the approaching evening hour. Preston stood, offering his hand to help her up. As she rose, they remained briefly connected, neither quite willing to let go. "Tabitha," he began, his voice uncertain for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. "Yes," she prompted when he fell silent. He seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "We should be getting back. Mrs. Winters will worry." That night, alone in her room, Tabitha found herself standing before her small mirror, studying her reflection. She opened her mouth, attempting to form notes that had once come as naturally as breathing. A whispered melody emerged, barely audible, nowhere near the confident soprano that had once earned her applause in Denver's finest venues, but undeniably her voice. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to acknowledge what had been growing increasingly obvious. She was falling in love with Preston Zachary. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Since losing Tessa, she'd kept everyone at a careful distance, afraid to risk her heart when life had proven so fragile. Yet somehow this quiet, thoughtful cowboy had bypassed her defenses. July brought scorching heat to Willow Creek. The creek itself diminished to a languid trickle, and townspeople conducted their business in the cooler morning hours when possible. The saloon, with its thick adobe walls, remained relatively comfortable even in the worst of the afternoon heat, making it a popular gathering place. It was during one such blistering afternoon that trouble arrived in the form of Theodore Blackburn, a wealthy cattle baron from the next county whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. Tabitha was practicing alone when he entered the saloon, followed by two hard-faced men who positioned themselves near the door. "Well, well," Blackburn drawled, approaching the piano with predatory confidence. "The famous Calloway girl hiding away in this backwater town. I attended your performances in Denver, you know. You and your sister were quite the attraction." Tabitha's hands stilled on the keys. Thank you for your patronage, Mr. Blackburn. If you'll excuse me, I hear you don't sing anymore, he continued as if she hadn't spoken. Tragic about your sister, but surely a woman of your talents is wasting herself in this dusty little settlement. I have an arrangement here that suits me, Tabitha replied, attempting to rise from the piano bench only to find Blackburn blocking her path. I have a better proposition. My ranch hosts regular gatherings for influential guests. The pay would be substantially more than whatever this establishment offers. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made his actual expectations uncomfortably clear. I'm not interested, Tabitha said firmly. Blackburn's expression hardened. Reconsider, Miss Calloway. I'm not accustomed to refusal, and I can make life difficult for those who disappoint me. The lady has declined, came Preston's voice from the doorway. He stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, his stance deceptively casual though Tabitha could see the tension in his shoulders. Blackburn turned slowly. This is a private conversation, Cowboy. Not in this establishment, it isn't. Preston stepped fully inside, ignoring Blackburn's men. Mr. Hollister pays me to ensure the comfort and safety of his performers. Right now, Miss Calloway appears uncomfortable. The cattle baron's eyes narrowed as he assessed Preston. Zachary, isn't it? I've heard of you. Former Union soldier turned drifter. Some business with the Cheyenne a few years back. Something flickered across Preston's face, surprise, perhaps, that this man knew details of his past. My history isn't relevant to the present situation, which is that Miss Calloway has declined your offer and would like you to leave her be. Blackburn smiled unpleasantly. Very protective. I wonder if your employer knows about your involvement with those Indians. Not everyone around here is as forgiving of such associations. Mr. Hollister judges men by their actions, not rumors, Preston replied evenly. Now, if you'd like to return this evening as a paying customer, you're welcome. Otherwise, I must ask you to leave. For a tense moment, Tabitha feared Blackburn would escalate the confrontation. Instead, he adjusted his expensive jacket and nodded to his men. We'll depart for now. But Miss Calloway, he turned back to her with cold determination, my offer remains open, for a limited time. When they'd gone, Preston crossed quickly to Tabitha. Are you all right? Did he harm you? No, just frightened me a bit, she admitted. How did you know to come? Mrs. Winters saw him heading this way, knew his reputation. She sent word. Preston's jaw tightened. Blackburn's dangerous, Tabitha. He controls much of the county's politics and isn't above using force to get what he wants. What was he implying about you and the Cheyenne? Tabitha asked carefully. Preston sighed, running a hand through his hair. After the war, I drifted west. Ended up living with a Cheyenne band for nearly 2 years. They took me in when I was at my lowest, taught me to find purpose again. His eyes met hers, gauging her reaction. Some consider such associations traitorous. And you never mentioned this because. Old habits of caution, he admitted. Prejudice runs deep in frontier towns. I've learned when to share my history and when to keep it private. Tabitha considered this new information. These Cheyenne, they taught you some of the songs we perform, didn't they? I've always wondered about their unusual melodies. Preston nodded, visibly relieved by her acceptance. Yes, sacred songs adapted for outside ears, stories of their people set to music. They believe songs carry power, healing, memory, connection to what matters. I'd like to hear more about them someday, Tabitha said. When you're ready to share that part of your life. Preston's expression softened with gratitude. Thank you for understanding. You've shown me nothing but understanding since we met, she replied. How could I offer less in return? That evening's performance proceeded without incident, though Preston positioned himself to keep the entrance in view. Blackburn did not return, but his earlier presence cast a shadow over Tabitha's usual enjoyment of their music. After they finished, Preston insisted on escorting her directly to the boarding house, his vigilance a reminder that Blackburn's interest might not have ended with that afternoon's confrontation. Perhaps I should return to Denver, Tabitha suggested as they reached her door. If my presence here brings trouble, running won't solve anything, Preston interrupted. Blackburn's type views retreat as weakness. Besides, he hesitated before continuing more softly, I don't want you to leave. The simple declaration hung between them in the quiet night air. Tabitha felt her heartbeat quicken as Preston slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, raised his hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I've been trying to find the right words," he said, his voice low and earnest. "The perfect way to tell you how much you've come to mean to me. But I'm discovering that sometimes, even for a man who sings nightly, words aren't adequate." "Then don't use words," Tabitha whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Preston's eyes darkened as he understood her invitation. With careful restraint, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that deepened when she responded with unexpected fervor. His arms encircled her waist as hers found their way around his neck, drawing them closer in the shadows of the porch. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for quite some time," he admitted. "Why did you wait?" she asked, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. "I needed to be certain you were ready. That you weren't simply looking for someone to fill the empty spaces grief creates." His honesty, as always, was direct without being cruel. "And I needed to know my own heart wasn't seeking redemption through saving someone else." Tabitha appreciated his thoughtfulness even as she marveled at the depth of understanding between them. "And now, are you certain that I'm falling in love with you?" "Yes," Preston said simply. "That the path ahead will be easy?" "No. Blackburn's interest concerns me, and we both carry complicated histories." "Perhaps that's why we fit so well together," Tabitha suggested. "We recognize the weight each other carries without needing it explained." Preston smiled, touching her cheek with tender reverence. "Get some rest, Tabitha. Tomorrow brings its own challenges." She watched him walk away, a tall figure moving confidently through the darkness, and felt something like hope unfurling within her chest, a sensation she'd nearly forgotten during the long months of grief. The following days brought no sign of Blackburn, though Preston remained vigilant. Their performances continued to draw appreciative crowds, and their personal relationship blossomed in quiet moments stolen between rehearsals and public appearances. Preston began teaching Tabitha to ride, believing the skill might prove necessary if trouble returned. She proved a natural horsewoman, her innate musicality translating to a good sense of rhythm and balance in the saddle. "My father would be scandalized," she laughed one morning as Preston helped her mount astride rather than side saddle. "He considered horseback riding barely acceptable for ladies and only with proper equipment." "Your father isn't in Colorado territory," Preston reminded her with a grin. "And proper equipment won't help you if you need to outride danger." They rode along the creek, finding a secluded meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the summer heat. Spreading a blanket in the shade of aspens, they shared a simple picnic of bread, cheese, and early apples from Mrs. Winter's tree. "Tell me about your dreams," Preston said as they lay side by side, watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky, before tragedy changed them. "What did you want from life?" Tabitha considered the question. "Tessa and I had plans to tour eastward Chicago, perhaps even New York. We thought our music might take us to places we'd only read about." She plucked a stem of grass, twirling it between her fingers. "But beneath the ambition was something simpler. I wanted to create beauty that moved people. To use music to express what words alone couldn't convey." "And now?" Preston asked gently. "Now?" Tabitha hesitated. "Now I'm learning that dreams can change shape without losing their essence. I still want to create beauty through music, but perhaps in different ways than I'd imagined." Preston reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You still can. With or without your singing voice, you're an extraordinary musician." She turned to face him, studying the sincerity in his expression. "What about you? What dreams guide Preston Zachary?" A shadow crossed his face. "For a long time after the war, I didn't allow myself dreams, just survival. The Cheyenne taught me to look forward again, to see possibilities beyond the next horizon." He squeezed her hand. "Lately, those possibilities have begun to include putting down roots. Finding home in a person rather than a place." The implication hung between them, too significant to be misunderstood yet still tentative enough not to demand immediate response. Tabitha felt simultaneous surges of joy and fear, joy at the depth of feeling growing between them, fear at the vulnerability such attachment created. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly, "of losing again, of loving and having it torn away." Fear is the shadow cast by what matters most, Preston said. Without something worth protecting, we'd have nothing to fear losing. Is that Cheyenne wisdom? She asked. He smiled. No, just the observation of a man who spent too many years afraid to care about anything. Their idyllic afternoon ended with approaching thunderclouds that sent them galloping back toward town through the first heavy raindrops. By the time they reached the stables, both were soaked and laughing, the simple joy of the moment washing away darker concerns. Preston helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. Rain plastered her hair to her face and neck, and droplets clung to her eyelashes. Without hesitation, he kissed her more passionately than their previous careful explorations, with an urgency that matched the storm surrounding them. "I love you, Tabitha," he said when they parted, the declaration simple yet profound against the backdrop of thunder. She touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "And I love you, Preston, despite my fears or perhaps because you helped me face them." They might have remained longer, but a flash of lightning followed by a deafening thunderclap reminded them of the storm's intensity. Preston escorted her quickly to the boarding house, both arriving on Mrs. Winter's porch breathless and dripping. The landlady took one look at their entwined hands and flushed faces and merely nodded, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "Best get changed before tonight's performance," she said matter-of-factly. "I'll bring up hot water for washing." As Preston prepared to leave, Tabitha caught his arm. "The song you sang that first night, the one about finding home, will you teach it to me?" He smiled, understanding the significance of her request. "Of course, tomorrow," she nodded, reluctant to let him go despite the practical necessity. Tomorrow. That evening's performance carried a new energy, the emotional connection between them translating into music that seemed to captivate the audience more deeply than ever. As Preston sang the final notes of their closing piece, Tabitha found herself softly humming harmony, audible perhaps only to him standing beside the piano. His eyes widened slightly at the sound, but he made no comment that might draw attention to this small but significant step. When they finished and acknowledged the applause, his hand briefly covered hers on the piano, a silent recognition of the moment's importance. Their walk home was interrupted by Mr. Hollister, who hurried after them with unusual urgency. "Preston, Miss Calloway, a word, if you please." They paused, turning to the saloon owner with concern. "Is something wrong, Mr. Hollister?" Preston asked. The older man glanced around before speaking in hushed tones. "Word in town is that Blackburn's been making inquiries about both of you, particularly about your schedule and habits." Tabitha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What sort of inquiries?" "The kind that suggest he's planning something," Hollister said grimly. "He's hired additional men rough types from outside the territory. And he's been asking specifically about your relationship with each other." Preston's expression hardened. "Has he made any direct threats?" "Nothing that could be proven," Hollister replied. "But I've lived in these parts long enough to recognize the signs of trouble brewing. Blackburn doesn't take rejection well, especially from those he considers beneath him, and he has particular views about women he sets his sights on." "We should leave town," Preston said decisively, turning to Tabitha. "At least temporarily, until Blackburn loses interest or focuses elsewhere." But Tabitha felt an unexpected surge of determination. "No, I've been running since Tessa died, from memories, from music, from connection. I won't be driven away by a man like Blackburn." "This isn't about courage, Tabitha," Preston argued, concern evident in his voice. "Blackburn is dangerous and well-connected. He could make good on his threats without facing consequences." "Then we'll be cautious," she countered. "Change our routines, stay alert, but I won't let fear dictate my choices anymore." Hollister nodded approvingly. "I respect your decision, Miss Calloway, and I'll do what I can to help. I've already spoken to Sheriff Daniels, though his jurisdiction is limited when it comes to someone of Blackburn's influence." "Thank you," Tabitha said gratefully. After Hollister departed, Preston walked Tabitha the rest of the way to her boarding house in troubled silence. At the door, he finally spoke. "I understand your reluctance to run, but promise me you'll be careful, no unnecessary risks." "I promise," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "But the same applies to you. Blackburn seems to have taken a dislike to both of us." Preston nodded, though something in his expression suggested he was withholding concerns. "Get some rest. I'll collect you for rehearsal tomorrow." The following morning brought clear skies and a sense of normalcy that belied their evening's conversation. Preston arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, and they walked together to the saloon for their daily practice. As promised, he began teaching her the song he'd performed that first night, a haunting melody about a wanderer who realizes that home exists in the heart of one who truly understands him. "It's beautiful," Tabitha said as she played through the accompaniment. "Did you write it?" Preston looked slightly embarrassed. "Parts of it. The chorus is adapted from a Cheyenne song about returning to one's people after a vision quest. The verses I added later when the original meaning began to blend with my own experiences." "Play it again," she requested. "And sing it fully this time." As Preston's voice filled the empty saloon, Tabitha closed her eyes, allowing the music to wash over her. Without conscious decision, her own voice began to join his hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. It wasn't the full, confident soprano of her performing days, but a softer, more intimate sound that complemented his baritone perfectly. Preston faltered briefly in surprise, then continued, his eyes never leaving her face as their voices intertwined for the first time. When the final notes faded, silence hung between them, not uncomfortable but filled with significance. "Tabitha," he finally said, her name emerging as little more than a whisper. "I didn't know if I could," she admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "It just happened." Preston knelt beside the piano bench, taking her hands in his. "It's all right if it's just this once. It's all right if you never sing again. What matters is that you followed where your heart led in this moment." It didn't hurt, she realized aloud. Singing with you, it felt like honoring Tessa rather than betraying her memory. Preston's smile held understanding beyond words. "Perhaps that's the gift of love. It doesn't replace what we've lost, but it helps us carry those memories differently." Their rehearsal continued with a new dimension, Tabitha occasionally joining vocally in places that felt natural, retreating to piano only when emotions threatened to overwhelm. By noon, they had arranged 3 songs to include her voice in limited but meaningful ways. "Should we incorporate this into tonight's performance?" Preston asked as they prepared to break for lunch. Tabitha considered the question carefully. "Not yet. I need to be certain this wasn't just a momentary breakthrough, but soon, perhaps." They were gathering their music when the saloon doors burst open, admitting Sheriff Daniels with an expression of grim urgency. "Zachary," he said without preamble, "you need to come with me now. Trouble's brewing at the north end of town." Preston tensed. "What kind of trouble?" "Blackburn's men picked a fight with Jesse Thompson, claiming he cheated at cards last night. They're threatening to hang him without trial." The sheriff's weathered face showed his frustration. "I need men I can trust to help maintain order." Preston turned to Tabitha, conflict evident in his expression. "Go," she urged. "Jesse has a wife and children. I'll return to the boarding house and stay there until you come for me." After a moment's hesitation, Preston nodded. "Lock your door, don't answer for anyone but Mrs. Winters or me." He kissed her quickly before following the sheriff out. Tabitha gathered their music and prepared to leave, uneasy despite her brave words. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, she spotted 2 unfamiliar men watching the saloon from across the street. Their posture and the way they straightened when they saw her suggested they weren't ordinary townspeople. Deciding against returning to the boarding house alone, Tabitha retreated into the saloon and locked the door behind her. Through the window, she observed the men exchange words before one departed while the other maintained his position. The implications were clear. Blackburn was having her watched. Making a quick decision, Tabitha slipped out through the saloon's rear entrance and made her way through back alleys toward the sheriff's office, hoping to find Preston or at least leave word about her situation. The streets seemed unusually empty, most townsfolk likely gathered at the site of the confrontation. She had nearly reached the sheriff's office when rough hands grabbed her from behind, one clamping over her mouth to prevent her scream. She struggled fiercely as she was dragged into a narrow passage between buildings. "Miss Calloway," came Theodore Blackburn's voice as he stepped from the shadows. "I apologize for the crude methods, but you've left me little choice." The hand over her mouth relaxed slightly, allowing her to speak. "What do you want, Mr. Blackburn?" His smile never reached his cold eyes. Initially, I simply wanted to add your talents to my household. Now, my interests have expanded to include teaching your cowboy a lesson about interfering with my affairs. Preston has done nothing to you, Tabitha protested. On the contrary, he's living a life he doesn't deserve after betraying his race and country by consorting with savages. Blackburn's voice held genuine disgust. Did you know your lover lived as one of them? That he took a Cheyenne woman to his bed, that he fought alongside them against white settlers. The accusations, delivered with such venom, caught Tabitha off guard. Preston had mentioned living with the Cheyenne but had shared few details. Could Blackburn's claims hold some truth? I don't believe you, she said firmly, though doubt had crept into her thoughts. Belief is irrelevant to facts, Miss Calloway. Blackburn gestured to his men. Bring her. The distraction at the north end should keep the sheriff and her protector occupied long enough. Tabitha renewed her struggles as they attempted to force her toward a waiting carriage. Help, she screamed, finally breaking free of the hand covering her mouth. Someone help me. Her cries were cut short by a sharp blow that sent her world spinning into darkness. Consciousness returned gradually, accompanied by the steady rhythm of horses' hooves and the creak of carriage wheels. Tabitha's head throbbed where she'd been struck, and her wrists burned from the ropes binding them. She kept her eyes closed, assessing her situation before revealing her wakeful state. The carriage swayed as it traveled what felt like a rough trail rather than a proper road. From the angle of sunlight warming her face, she guessed several hours had passed since her abduction. Voices drifted from outside Blackburn giving instructions to his men as they apparently paused in their journey. Carefully opening her eyes, Tabitha found herself alone in the carriage's interior. Through the window, she could see dense pine forest surrounding them. They'd left the valley and climbed into the mountains, making pursuit more difficult. Her heart sank as she realized how thoroughly Blackburn had planned this abduction. The carriage door suddenly opened, revealing Blackburn himself. Ah, you're awake, good. We'll be reaching my hunting lodge shortly, far more private than my main ranch house. People will look for me, Tabitha said, her voice steadier than she felt. Of course they will, Blackburn agreed pleasantly. That's part of the plan. Your cowboy will come charging to your rescue, allowing me to deal with both problems simultaneously. The calculated cruelty in his tone chilled her. Why do you hate Preston so much? What could he possibly have done to warrant this? Blackburn's expression hardened. My younger brother was killed in a raid led by the very Cheyenne band your lover joined. White men who turn against their own kind deserve worse than hanging, understanding dawned. This wasn't merely about her rejection or Preston's interference. Blackburn was pursuing a personal vendetta, using her as bait. The realization brought both fear and determination. Somehow she needed to escape before Preston walked into this trap. I'm sorry about your brother, she said, hoping to establish some human connection. Truly, war brings terrible losses to all sides. Save your sympathy, Blackburn replied coldly. It won't change what's coming. The carriage resumed its journey, climbing higher into the mountains. Tabitha tested her bonds surreptitiously, finding them painfully tight but not entirely immovable. If an opportunity presented itself, she might be able to work free given enough time. Nearly an hour later, they arrived at a substantial log structure set in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Unlike the rustic hunting cabins Tabitha had occasionally seen in her travels, this lodge was clearly built for comfort, with glass windows and a stone chimney from which smoke already rose. Welcome to your temporary home, Miss Calloway, Blackburn said as his men helped her from the carriage. I suggest you make yourself comfortable. Your stay's duration depends entirely on how quickly your cowboy picks up your trail. Inside, the lodge proved as well appointed as its exterior suggested. A large main room featured leather furniture, bearskin rugs, and hunting trophies mounted on the walls. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while oil lamps provided warm illumination as evening approached. Blackburn directed his men to place Tabitha in a chair near the fire, where he personally removed the ropes from her wrists. There's no need for physical restraints here, he explained, gesturing toward the armed men positioned at doors and windows. Geography and my employees provide all the security required. Rubbing her chafed wrists, Tabitha assessed her surroundings, looking for anything that might aid escape. The windows were too well guarded, the doors likewise watched. Her best hope seemed to be creating some distraction that might allow her to slip away into the surrounding forest. "What happens if Preston doesn't come?" she asked, buying time to think. Blackburn smiled unpleasantly. "He'll come. Men like Zachary are predictably heroic. But should he prove an exception, you and I will continue to my main ranch, where you'll fulfill your original purpose by entertaining my guests." As darkness fell, Tabitha was provided a surprisingly decent meal, though she ate little, her appetite diminished by fear and tension. She was then escorted to a small but comfortable bedroom and locked inside. The room's single window was securely shuttered from the outside, eliminating that potential escape route. Alone at last, Tabitha allowed herself a moment of despair before forcing her mind to focus on practical solutions. The bedroom door, while solid, had an old-fashioned lock that might be vulnerable to manipulation. Without proper tools, however, such efforts would likely prove futile. Examining the room more thoroughly, she discovered a small, ornate fireplace poker beside the cold hearth. Not much of a weapon, but perhaps useful for the lock. As she retrieved it, inspiration struck from an unexpected source: music. Throughout her career, Tabitha had used her voice to evoke emotional responses from audiences. Perhaps now that same voice might serve a different purpose. Blackburn's men, likely bored with guard duty in a remote location, might be susceptible to distraction by unexpected entertainment. It was a desperate plan, but better than passive waiting. Setting the poker beside the door for quick access, Tabitha moved to the center of the room, closed her eyes, and began to sing softly at first, then with increasing volume. She chose a melancholy ballad about lost love, allowing all her fear and longing to infuse the melody with genuine emotion. The song finished, she immediately began another, this one livelier, the kind that typically prompted foot tapping and smiles. Through the door came the sound of conversation, then footsteps approaching. She continued singing, moving closer to the door where the poker lay hidden. "Miss Calloway," came a gruff voice as the lock rattled. The boss didn't say nothing about singing. The door opened to reveal one of Blackburn's hired men, his expression caught between suspicion and appreciation. "You got a fine voice," he acknowledged. "But Mr. Blackburn wants you quiet like." "I'm sorry," Tabitha said with practiced contrition. "I sing when I'm nervous, always have since childhood, it calms me." The man seemed uncertain how to respond. Before he could decide, another guard appeared behind him. "What's going on, Jenkins?" The second man demanded. "She's singing. Boss might not like it." The newcomer peered past his colleague at Tabitha. "Don't see the harm in it. Makes the watch less boring." Their momentary disagreement provided no opportunity for Tabitha to use the poker without being immediately overpowered. Changing tactics, she offered what she hoped was a disarming smile. "Perhaps I could sing in the main room. It would be more comfortable than being confined, and you gentlemen could enjoy the music properly." The guards exchanged glances, clearly tempted. "Boss said to keep her secure," the first one muttered doubtfully. "She ain't going nowhere surrounded by all of us," the second reasoned, "and she's right be more pleasant than listening through the door." After a brief discussion, they agreed, escorting Tabitha to the main room where 3 other men lounged with bottles of whiskey. Their surprised expressions quickly gave way to interest as her purpose was explained. "Well now," drawled the oldest of them, a grizzled man with a substantial scar across one cheek. "A private performance from the famous Miss Calloway. Ain't we the lucky ones?" Tabitha noted that Blackburn himself was absent, likely retired to his own quarters elsewhere in the lodge. This might work to her advantage if she could gain the guard's trust. For the next hour, she performed a variety of songs, carefully selecting pieces that evoked nostalgia, homeland, and family emotions that might soften these hardened men. Between songs, she engaged them in conversation, learning names and small personal details that humanized them in her mind, even as she hoped to do the same in theirs. "My wife used to sing that one," Jenkins admitted after a particularly touching ballad about faithful love across distance. "Before the fever took her 3 winters back." "She would be proud to know you remembered," Tabitha replied gently. "Music carries memories better than almost anything else." As the evening progressed, the atmosphere relaxed considerably. Two of the men dozed off, affected by both whiskey and the soothing quality of her voice. The remaining three, though still alert, had visibly lowered their guard. "Might I trouble you for some water?" Tabitha asked during a pause. "Singing this long leaves one quite parched." Jenkins nodded, rising to fetch a glass from a side table. As he handed it to her, Tabitha allowed their fingers to brush, establishing a human connection beyond captor and captive. "Thank you for your kindness," she said sincerely. "I understand you're simply following orders, but small courtesies mean a great deal in difficult circumstances." Jenkins looked uncomfortable, glancing away. "Just doing my job, miss, nothing personal." "Of course," she agreed, "though I wonder if Mr. Blackburn explained exactly why I'm here." "The true purpose behind my abduction," another guard frowned. "Said you'd refused a business proposition, that you needed persuading." Tabitha took a calculated risk, and the trap for Preston Zachary. "Did he explain that my kidnapping is primarily bait to lure a man to his death over events that happened years ago?" Uncertainty flickered across their faces. Clearly, Blackburn hadn't shared all his motivations with his hired help. "Not our concern," the scarred man said firmly. "We get paid to follow orders, not question them." "Of course," Tabitha agreed again, "though I would think a man's reasons might matter when those orders involve abduction and likely murder." A tense silence followed her words, broken by the sudden sound of horses approaching at speed. The guards instantly became alert, reaching for weapons. "Get her back to the room," the scarred man ordered, gesturing toward Jenkins. "Could be the cowboy already." Jenkins gripped Tabitha's arm, hurrying her back toward the bedroom as the other guards moved to defensive positions. As they reached the hallway, Tabitha made her decision. "Jenkins," she whispered urgently, "whatever happens next, remember you have a choice. Your wife would want you to be the man she loved, not someone who stands by while murder happens." He gave her a troubled look, but said nothing as he locked her in the room once more. Alone again, Tabitha pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear what was happening. Voices from the main room indicated that the new arrivals weren't Preston, but rather additional men Blackburn had summoned. Relief mingled with disappointment. Preston wasn't yet in danger, but her chance for assistance had disappeared. She retrieved the poker from its hiding place and began carefully working at the lock, using techniques she'd once observed a stagehand employ when a dressing room door had jammed. Progress was frustratingly slow, the lock's mechanism refusing to yield to her amateur attempts. Outside, the night grew quieter as most of the men apparently settled down to wait. Occasionally, footsteps passed her door, regular patrol checks to ensure she remained secured. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as Tabitha alternated between working the lock and resting her increasingly sore hands. Near what she estimated to be midnight, a new sound caught her attention, not from the main room, but from the shuttered window. A faint scratching, too deliberate to be wind or wildlife. Heart-pounding, she abandoned the lock and moved silently to the window, pressing her ear against the wooden shutters. "Tabitha," came an almost inaudible whisper from outside. "Stand back from the window, Preston." Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by renewed fear. He'd come alone, exactly as Blackburn had predicted. "It's a trap," she whispered back urgently. "Blackburn has at least 8 armed men. He knows you'll come for me." A brief silence followed. "I know. Sheriff Daniels and 6 deputized men are positioned in the trees, but I needed to find you first, make sure you're unharmed." Hope surged within her. Preston hadn't rushed in blindly after all. "I'm all right," she assured him. "But be careful, Blackburn wants you dead." "Something about his brother and the Cheyenne." "James Blackburn," Preston confirmed grimly, "led a massacre against a peaceful camp. The survivors fought back when cornered. I wasn't even there, but Theodore never let facts interfere with his vendetta." The patrol footsteps approached again, forcing Tabitha to retreat from the window. She held her breath until they passed, then returned. "They check every 15 minutes, she whispered. "What's the plan?" "Daniels and his men will create a distraction at the front. When Blackburn's men respond, I'll break in through this window and get you out the back way to waiting horses." It seemed dangerously simple, but Tabitha had no better alternative to offer. "Be careful," she urged again. "Always." His voice softened. Tabitha, no matter what happens, know that loving you has been the greatest gift of my life." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving silently away from the window. Tabitha prepared herself, gathering her skirts and tying them to allow easier movement. She positioned herself beside the door, poker in hand as a last resort weapon should things go wrong. The wait seemed interminable. Then suddenly, multiple gunshots shattered the night's silence, followed by shouting from the front of the lodge. Heavy footsteps thundered past her door as guards rushed to respond to the attack. Seconds later, she heard the shutters being forced open, then Preston was climbing through the window, his tall frame barely fitting through the opening. "Quickly," he urged, helping her toward the window. "We have minutes at most before they realize it's primarily a distraction." As Tabitha prepared to climb out, the bedroom door burst open. Theodore Blackburn stood in the doorway, a pistol leveled directly at Preston. "How predictably gallant," he sneered. "Though I expected you to come alone, Zachary, involving the sheriff was a surprise." Preston moved subtly, positioning himself between Blackburn and Tabitha. "This vendetta is between us, Blackburn. Let her go." "I think not." Blackburn's finger tightened on the trigger. "She's witnessed too much now. Unfortunately, I'll have to tell the sheriff how I discovered notorious outlaws holding her captive, how tragically I was too late to save either of you." Time seemed to slow as Tabitha saw Blackburn's intent crystallize in his eyes. Without conscious thought, she opened her mouth and released a piercing, sustained high note, the kind that could shatter glass in opera houses and had once been her performance trademark. The unexpected sound startled Blackburn just enough to throw off his aim. His shot went wide as Preston lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled for control of the weapon, crashing against furniture as Tabitha continued screaming to draw attention from the sheriff's men outside. The gun discharged again during the struggle, the sound deafening in the confined space. For a horrible moment, Tabitha couldn't tell who had been hit. Then Preston rose slowly, blood staining his shirt sleeve but otherwise intact. Blackburn remained on the floor, clutching his thigh where the bullet had struck. "It's over, Blackburn," Preston said, retrieving the fallen pistol. "The sheriff will be here any moment. Your vendetta ends tonight." True to his word, Sheriff Daniels burst through the bedroom door seconds later, his own weapon drawn. Taking in the scene with experienced eyes, he quickly assessed the situation and directed his deputies to secure Blackburn. "You all right, Zachary?" he asked, noting the blood on Preston's arm. "Just a graze," Preston assured him, never taking his eyes off Tabitha. "Are you hurt?" he asked her with urgent concern. "No," she managed, her voice hoarse from screaming. "You came for me." "I will always come for you," he promised, finally moving to take her in his arms. "Always." The aftermath unfolded with surprising efficiency. Blackburn's men, finding themselves outnumbered and their employer captured, surrendered without further resistance. Jenkins, true to Tabitha's hope, had actually stepped aside when the sheriff's men entered, unwilling to fight for Blackburn's personal vendetta once he understood the full situation. Dawn was breaking as Preston and Tabitha, accompanied by the sheriff's posse, began the journey back to Willow Creek. Riding double on Preston's horse, Tabitha leaned against his chest, exhausted but profoundly grateful for the steady heartbeat against her back. "That scream," Preston said as they rode, "I've never heard anything like it." Tabitha smiled tiredly. "My performance signature, once upon a time, Tessa used to say it could wake the dead." "It certainly saved the living tonight," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You saved both of us, Tabitha." The realization settled within her. She had used her voice, her true voice, in a moment of desperate need, not for performance or applause, but to protect someone she loved. Perhaps that was the key that had been missing in all her attempts to sing again, purpose beyond herself. They reached Willow Creek by mid-morning, causing quite a stir as townsfolk gathered to hear the story of Blackburn's capture. Mrs. Winters fussed over Tabitha, insisting she needed rest and hot food before answering any questions. Preston's wound was properly cleaned and bandaged by the town doctor, who pronounced it minor but worth watching for infection. That evening, despite protests that they should rest, Preston and Tabitha insisted on performing as scheduled. The saloon was packed beyond capacity, everyone eager to see the pair who had survived such an ordeal. As they took their positions at the piano, a respectful hush fell over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Tonight's performance will be somewhat different from our usual offerings. Miss Calloway and I have a new arrangement we'd like to share with you." He nodded to Tabitha, who began playing the introduction to the song he'd taught her just days earlier, the one about finding home in another's heart. When the moment came for vocals to join the piano, Preston began as usual, his baritone rich with emotion. But in the second verse, another voice joined his, clear, confident, and beautiful. Tabitha Calloway was singing again, her soprano weaving around Preston's deeper tones in perfect harmony. The audience sat stunned, many with tears in their eyes as they witnessed what felt like a miracle. When the final notes faded, silence held for a breathless moment before the room erupted in thunderous applause. Through tear-blurred vision, Tabitha saw Mrs. Winters openly weeping, Mr. Hollister pounding his hands together with unrestrained joy, and even the stoic Sheriff Daniels wiping suspiciously at his eyes. Preston took her hand, raising it to his lips before turning to the audience. "Thank you for sharing this moment with us. It means more than you can know." Later, walking home beneath a canopy of stars, Preston stopped suddenly, turning to face Tabitha with intense emotion. "I had this all planned differently," he admitted, reaching into his pocket. "A proper courtship, permission sought from whatever family you have remaining, a ring purchased from Denver rather than this." He withdrew a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone. "The Cheyenne taught me that turquoise represents the sky and water elements that connect all living things. I've carried this for years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Preston knelt in the middle of the quiet street, holding the ring up to Tabitha. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, wherever that may lead. Will you marry me, Tabitha Calloway?" Tabitha looked down at this man who had helped her find her voice again, not by demanding she heal according to others' timetables, but by offering to sing for them both until she was ready. A man who understood loss yet chose hope despite it. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear in the night air. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston Zachary." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her, Tabitha began to softly sing, not for an audience, not from obligation, but simply from the overflow of joy in her heart. Preston joined her, their voices twining together beneath the vast western sky, creating harmony from individual melodies once broken by grief. They were married 3 weeks later in Willow Creek's small church, with the entire town in attendance. Tabitha wore a simple white dress with the blue ribbon that had once belonged to Tessa, sewn into the hem, her sister's presence honored even in absence. Preston stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving his bride as they exchanged vows. At the reception that followed, Mr. Hollister surprised them with an announcement. He was expanding the Golden Nugget to include a proper theater with the Zacharys as its permanent musical directors. "This town needs beauty and culture," he declared, "and you two are just the ones to provide it." As evening settled over the celebration, Preston led Tabitha to the center of the makeshift dance floor. "I believe it's tradition for the bride and groom to perform something on their wedding day," he said, smiling at their friends gathered around them. "With your permission." At the crowd's enthusiastic approval, Tabitha took a deep breath and began to sing alone, the first time she had done so publicly since losing Tessa. Her voice, carrying all the emotion of the day, filled the room with a song of love discovered after loss, of hope reborn from ashes. When she faltered slightly during the final verse, overcome by the significance of the moment, Preston stepped closer and whispered, "Remember what I told you that first night? If you can't sing, I'll sing for us both." But Tabitha shook her head, smiling through tears as she took his hand. "No. Now we sing together." And so they did, their voices rising in perfect harmony as the golden light of sunset bathed Willow Creek in the promise of tomorrow. 5 years later, the Zachary School of Music occupied a prominent building on Willow Creek's Main Street, which had grown considerably since Theodore Blackburn's defeat and subsequent imprisonment. Preston and Tabitha had established a thriving arts community that drew visitors from across Colorado territory, their annual performances becoming regional attractions. In their comfortable home at the edge of town, 4-year-old Tabitha Zachary practiced simple scales on a child-sized piano while her 2-year-old brother James watched with wide-eyed fascination. Preston sat nearby, composing his latest piece, a commissioned work for Denver's new opera house. Tabitha entered carrying a letter bearing an Eastern postmark. "It's from the Boston Symphony," she announced, excitement coloring her voice. "They've accepted our proposal for a concert series featuring Western folk music arranged for orchestra." Preston looked up with pride. "Your arrangements deserve to be heard by a wider audience." "Our arrangements," she corrected, sitting beside him. "I couldn't have done it without your knowledge of traditional songs." He smiled, touching the turquoise ring she still wore alongside her gold wedding band. "We make a good team, Mrs. Zachary." "The best," she agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they watched their children discover music's joy for themselves. That evening, as had become their tradition, Preston and Tabitha sat on their porch singing lullabies while the children fell asleep inside. Their voices, now perfectly attuned to each other after years of partnership, drifted through the twilight air of the town that had witnessed their individual healing and joint triumph. "Do you ever miss it?" Preston asked during a pause. "The larger stages, the acclaim you had in Denver?" Tabitha considered the question before shaking her head. "What I have now is far richer than what I lost. Music means more to me than it ever did before, not as performance, but as connection. To you, to our children, to this community." Preston nodded, understanding as always. "From silence to song again." "With your help," she acknowledged. "You kept your promise that night. You sang for us both until I found my voice again." "And now we sing together," he said, taking her hand as they began another melody that rose toward the emerging stars, two voices that had once been silenced by grief, now joined in harmony that spoke of love's enduring power to heal even the deepest wounds. In Willow Creek, Colorado, where a desperate cowboy had once promised to sing for a woman who couldn't bring herself to sing again, the music continued, stronger for having been tested, sweeter for having been lost, and perfect in its imperfection, just like the love that had made it possible.